Hey everyone, and welcome back to Behind the Spacebar. This is episode 21, how to improve your in-ear mix without spending any money. If this is your first time here, Behind the Spacebar is a podcast that goes live every Monday, 10 a.m. Central, and it's for music directors, musicians, playback techs, really anyone that uses Ableton Live on stage to perform with. This is not your first time and you're coming back. Man, thank you so much for being here. This is such a fun podcast to do every Monday. It's a cool space to have space and time to talk about stuff that isn't necessarily a tutorial video. I'm having a blast. It's one of my favorite pieces of content to record every week. Now we're at the tail end here of a 3-part series all about in-ears. So we started this series talking about why your band should use in-ears. Last week we talked about how to transition to using in-ears. And today we're talking about what I think is maybe my favorite piece of this, which is how to improve your in-ear mix and how to do it specifically without spending any money. So I've got 7 tips for you today that I want to share that will help you improve your in-ear mix. Again, no matter what type of mixer you have, no matter whether you're doing wireless in-ears, wired in-ears, whatever it is, and without spending any money. Okay, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, let's dive in. So tip number 1 is reset your expectations. One of the first things I teach people when I'm starting to teach and talk about using in-ears is the idea that we're using in-ear monitors, not in-ear listeners. Now that sounds really stupid. You've never called something a listener before. But I think one of the mistakes we often make is we plug our in-ears in and we expect it to sound like a polished, mastered, finished recording, like CD quality, streaming quality. You know, you've listened to a song and it just sounds amazing and it sounds perfect. And then you pop your in-ears in and it sounds awful and you're super frustrated. Well, the thing I always remind people is, well, the goal of this is not to sound CD quality. The goal of this is to monitor. The goal of this is to appropriately hear enough of things so that we can perform well on stage. If you're a worship leader, the goal is to hear the band on stage, hear the other vocalist, hear the congregation, to respond well enough to lead people in worship well, as opposed to sounding like the CD. Now, to contrast this idea, there's been a couple times I've been in a conference and I'm talking about Ableton, or I've talked about in-ears. I will say just a couple weeks ago now, I was at an Ableton event here in Austin. And every time I teach, no matter what I teach, undoubtedly someone asks a question about in-ears. And so that came up at the Ableton event. But at events previous where it's like me and maybe a band or an artist, and it's kind of like either a panel thing or I'm talking and they're talking. And almost always someone will ask a question about in-ears. And when it comes time to the band folks, the musicians, the artists, people will ask something about in-ears, how they struggle with the in-ears. And a couple times now I've heard these artists say, well, the trick is you've got to make it sound just like the CD. Like you want to have CD quality in-ears. And I go, man, that's terrible advice. And here's why I think it's terrible advice. And here's why I think they think it's good advice. As these artists are traveling with monitor engineers that they have handpicked, people that are trained, and all they do for a living, or the majority of what they do for a living, is to listen and to mix in-ears for artists. And they have someone who listens to their in-ear mix and tweaks it, and they EQ it and they compress it, and they do everything to get it just right to make it perfect. So undoubtedly, they probably do have a CD quality style mix. They probably do have a mix that sounds just as good as the record. But the rest of us, it takes a little more to get there because we're not trained in mixing. We're not professional trained mix engineers. And if that's the scenario you're in, I would highly encourage you to reset your expectations from CD quality excellence to monitoring. Now, monitoring doesn't mean it has to suck. Doesn't mean it has to be bad. It just means the goal is to monitor, to hear things appropriately on stage. Okay. Tip number 2, keep both in-ears in. Now, I empathize with you. I particularly feel bad for you vocalists out there, but you should keep both of your in-ears in. I think we've talked about this in previous episodes. I even talked about this a couple weeks ago at that event in Austin when we got the question about in-ears and monitoring. But you should keep both your in-ears in. Here's why. If I take this in-ear out, I'm no longer isolating. So if I leave both in-ears in, I am isolating. I'm using custom in-ears. And so those molds are isolating the noise around me. If I take one of my in-ears out, one ear is closed off and one ear is open to the surroundings. Now, this isn't bad when I'm here in the studio. I mean, there's not like sound around me. I'm not hearing a large guitar amp or bass amp over my shoulder, or even worse, a drum set over my shoulder. It's just blaring audio into my ear. But if I am on stage, I now have this ear that is great and it sounds really good, but I am opening this ear up and I'm hearing a full band behind me. Now that full band is super loud. It's way louder like this with my ear out than it is with my ear in. So what do? We turn up the volume of this in-ear to match the volume that we hear here, right? It's really, really odd to have this at a lower volume than what you're hearing here. And this is always going to be louder again than when your in-ear is out. What ends up happening is you turn up this in-ear louder to compensate to match that particular volume that you're hearing without your ears in. And that's super dangerous. It's bad for your hearing. I've also heard stories of singers and musicians like passing out on stage and ended up getting vertigo because their balance and their equilibrium is thrown off by having one in-ear in and the other one out. So I know it's difficult. I know it's tough. I've got 2 tips up front here really quickly that will help, particularly for you vocalists. If you've never experienced this before and don't understand why vocalists struggle so much with in-ears, then put your fingers in your ears and just talk. And what do you hear? You kind of hear it like rattling around in your brain. You hear it in these bones almost. And it's like you hear double of yourself. It's a really, really odd feeling. Like I don't love singing with in-ears. Thankfully, I don't sing very often, if at all anymore. But when I did, it was tough to do with in-ears. I'm not going to lie. So that gets me to tip number 3 for vocals. Here's a couple tips you can use. Add effects to your in-ear mix. So particularly as a vocalist, you drop your in-ears in. Again, you hear like double of yourself. I guess even for me talking now, it's like I kind of hear myself in my head. I'm not listening to myself in my in-ears. That's a weird experience even now if I really think about it. But what can really help, particularly when you're singing, is add effects to your vocals. So as opposed to just singing and hearing your vocals super dry, if you take your ears out and you sing, you hear the reverb in the room. You hear the way your vocal is responding to the room. And so what I would suggest is work with your sound engineer, or if you don't have a sound engineer, maybe you're at a church and you're the sole person, you're the person doing it. Take some time on a Saturday, take some time on a rehearsal Thursday where you could go behind the mix, put your in-ears in, and try singing and then turning some reverb up in your in-ears so that as opposed to just singing to a dry vocal, you are hearing your vocals with reverb, with effects. Sometimes people will put delay in there as well too. But you want to work with your sound engineer to make sure the pre-post settings are correct on this. So that, for instance, when you talk, you typically don't hear reverb. The reverb ducks out of your ears and you just hear your mic dry. And then when you sing, the reverb comes back in. So it feels like, again, you're not singing to a dry, empty room. But you have to work with your audio engineer. It's a little outside of the scope of this podcast episode to dive into that. But for vocals, consider adding effects to your vocals. That will really, really help. You don't want to go crazy with it, but it's going to help you feel like you're not singing to a completely dead, empty space. Number 4, add audience response mics. Now, yes, I'm cheating because you may have to go buy this. You may have to go buy some shotgun mics, some condenser mics, and place them strategically in your room. But if you happen to be in a venue, you happen to be at a church and you've got some extra mics sitting around, try placing them in your room. You want to be careful to not put them like right to where they just pick up the speaker, because then you're just basically hearing the front of house speakers, back into your in-ears. But try placing them, side of stage, pointed out. This will really help you gauge the response of the room, right? I see this with worship leaders a lot, trying to connect to the congregation. I see this with lead vocalists trying to connect. I mean, even like in a small club that's like a 200 cap room, it's not a big room. You'll see vocalists pull their in-ears out to hear if the crowd's singing, how the crowd is responding. If you're just talking, I mean, that's not the end of the world to do, to pull your ears out and gauge the response of the room. But what's even better is if you can leave your in-ears in and you can add some really nice room mics, then you can really start to fill the room. Now you want to be careful that you bring these, up in your room, in your in-ear mix enough to gauge the response of the room, but not up so much that it muddies up your mix. That's a mistake I see a lot of people make, is they throw room mics up and either they're placed improperly so that you're just basically hearing the speakers and the output of the speakers, which is not helpful, or they turn them up so much in the mix that it just muddies your mix up and you can't hear anything with clarity. clarity. So you want to be really, really careful with that. Okay, so that's tip number 4. Now tip number 5, I've got a video clip here for you to play this to start this one off.
I declare bankruptcy!
So what I want to suggest that you do for tip number 5 is to declare mix bankruptcy. And what I mean by that is essentially this: start over. We're going to start over from scratch. I often see this happen. A similar thing happen when you're in the studio, when you're recording, you're producing, and you're going to create a mix. And you create your mix and you feel like it sounds really good. And then you like go out to lunch and you come back and you realize it sounds awful. And then you start tweaking a few things. And eventually you take all your effects off and you go, hey, this sounded a lot better when I had no processing or effects on it. Sometimes it's better just to declare mix bankruptcy. You literally start over and you set everything to 0. Okay, now once you get to that point, here's what you need to do. You need to do tip number 6. We talked about this, I believe, last week. So it's going to be a bit of a refresher, but I'll go quickly. You need to apply my quick mix tip. Okay. This is something I apply. I remember a few years ago flying out to San Diego to play at a friend of mine's church. And I talked an Ableton session. And then it was like, hey, after the session, we're going to do rehearsal. And I still like have this panicked dream to where I didn't have enough time after the Ableton session and I couldn't set up beforehand because of what was happening in the auditorium, that I had to like run from my Ableton class to go set up for rehearsal. And I made it halfway through and gosh, it was just such a disaster. And I wasn't supposed to wear jeans and I was supposed to wear a dress coat, but no one told me. I mean, I still have nightmares. I'm like replaying this in my head. But one of the things that happened is I showed up on stage on a stage I've never played with an amp I've never played with. And I had to plug my pedal board in, plug my guitar in and get tone and get levels. And I got there and it was good. But then I had to mix my in-ears and they had little Avion personal monitor mixes at that particular stage and setup. And so that's what I had to use. But again, I had no time. We had no sound check. Well, they had a sound check. I didn't because I was teaching an Ableton class. So when I rolled into that situation, what did I do? I really quickly applied this quick mix tip. Here we go. So we said already, set everything to 0. Next, set your master volume for your in-ear pack, for your Avion, for your aux going to your ears, whatever it is, set that to 75%. That's going to give you plenty of volume so that you're not getting hiss and you're not amplifying hiss in the signal. It's going to give you plenty of volume, but it's going to give you some headroom, meaning you have about 25% between 75 and 100. You have about, I'm good at math. See, you got about 25% range there to increase beyond what you're currently at, which is good. We want to have a little bit of headroom. But I would say set your master volume at about 75%. Next, you want to turn yourself up in the mix. You want to make sure you hear yourself well enough, whether you're a vocalist, whether you're a guitar player, whatever it is, play your guitar. Does it respond? Does it feel right? Get your EQ right on your guitar amp. Work with the audio engineer to make sure that feels right and sounds right in your ears. If you're a vocalist, again, that's where you want to take some time and think about the reverb and effects, if you can add those in and communicate with the audio engineer to make sure they have that. All right. But we want to bring ourselves up. Next, we want a timing reference. For most modern bands, and I hate using modern because sometimes it sounds offensive, like if you're not modern, you're like out of date and older, but most bands now, this means using a click. For your timing reference, you want to bring your metronome, your click up loud enough so that you can stay in time with that. If you're not using click, it's most likely going to be your drummer, but you want some sort of timing reference, right, to keep you in time. If it's drums, you're going to want kick, hat, snare mainly to start with. We're going to deal with cymbals and toms later. Kick, hat, snare mostly if you can. Once we have our timing reference, the next thing we need is a pitch reference. If you're a vocalist, typically this would be like piano or synth, something that we know is going to be in tune or should be in tune, as opposed to like an acoustic guitar or electric guitar. We want something so it doesn't feel like we're like performing as a solo performer with nothing to base our pitch reference on, right? We want to make sure that we are in pitch as we sing, as we play. And so we need a pitch reference. So everything is 0. We set our master to 75%. We turn ourselves up. We feel comfortable with that. Next, we bring up some sort of timing reference. Next, we bring up some sort of pitch reference. Then the next step is to bring up whoever you're locking in with or blending with. So if you're a bassist, you're going to bring up the drummer. If you're a drummer, you're going to bring up the bass. If you're limited on time and the drum mix is bad, if you're a bassist, you're going to bring up the kick drum so you can lock in well with the kick, right? You have to make decisions here. If you're a rhythm player, a guitar player, you're going to bring up the other guitar. And you want want to make sure you're not bringing everything up to zero. You kind of want to level things up, almost like a mix pyramid, if you will. So next we're going to bring whoever you're locking in with, blending with. For vocals, this is, if you're the lead vocalist, you'll bring your BGVs up lower than what you are at, but you start bringing them up to where they're a good level to where you can sing and still hear them, but it's not like at unity with what your vocal is. And then finally, bring everything else up, everyone else up accordingly. But here's what I mean. Like, again, don't just bring everything up to zero or you're causing the same problem again. You want to bring it up, to where there's just maybe, if we think of 100%, maybe we have 20% of everything else kind of blended in. Based on your scenario, that may mean you want to bring tracks up more. You may want to bring click up louder. You may want to bring 2 of the 3 vocalists up, 3 of the 3 vocalists up, bring the acoustic guitar and whatever, or you may want to cut instruments. When it gets, again, super out of time, this last step for me is I kind of just slowly kind of work it to go, okay, I need some room mics. Okay, too much, bring those down. It would be nice to hear acoustic, too much. Okay, bring that down and finally land somewhere that feels good. Finally, tip number 7, as we start to wrap up here, is use panning. So if you're using a stereo in-ear setup, that means you have the ability to have left and right sounds and move them kind of in the stereo space. Well, what we do with volume is we're bringing things up and down this way. So we're creating space this way, right? We have this much space. We place this here, and maybe place this here. We're filling out space up and down. With panning, we're filling out space left and right. So what you could start to do is say, okay, I am singing. I'm looking here. I have a vocalist here and a vocalist here. What I would suggest, if you have independent control over them, is take this vocalist and pan them so they're over here in your left ear. Take this vocalist and pan them so they're in your right ear, right? To make that a little easier to where it feels right. I know there's systems like Clang, where as you turn, it kind of repositions whatever. It's like spatial audio. But essentially, just basic in-ear system, just pan based on what you see on stage. For drums, adjust your panning. Particularly for drummers, work with the sound engineer so that as you play your toms, you hear, as opposed to like hearing it. I don't know that I could represent this well, but as opposed to hitting your high tom and you hear it like far left in the back of your ears, like that spatially just doesn't relate, right? And that's going to cause you to struggle to play. But volume is up and down, panning is left to right. This is going to give you room in your mix. So things that aren't as important, pan them out to the right. If you have stereo content like keys, pan them to the right to kind of clean up space in the middle. Keep sub heavy content, bass heavy content in the middle. Keep your kick in the middle. But experiment with pan. And I think if you do that, you're going to find some really, really helpful ways to clean up your mix really, really quickly. Now, if you are someone who's looking to perform on stage with Ableton Live, to use tracks on stage with Ableton Live, I've got a bunch of free resources that I put together for you to help you do this a lot easier, to get up and running a lot faster than trying to do this on your own. To get access to those, head to FromStudioToStage.com/free. It's FromStudioToStage.com/free. I've got a link in the show notes and then in the description of this video if you want to check that out. These free resources are created from resources that cost hundreds of dollars and they're completely free to you. It's a great way to get started. Everything from click tracks to time code and everything you could possibly imagine in between, you'll find there. So make sure you head there to check that out. And if you enjoyed this podcast, again, we post new episodes every Monday at 10 a.m. Central, but I post new tutorials. I have a podcast on Thursday for worship leaders that goes live. But I post new content every single day, 10 a.m. Central. To make sure you see that, hit the subscribe icon to this channel so that you're subscribed, and hit the bell icon so you're notified when I post new content. What I keep telling people to do is download the YouTube app on your phone, look over, and when that notification pops up, if it's something you're interested in, click through and watch, and if not, ignore it, and you could catch me on the next one. But I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks for watching and listening to this episode of Behind the Spacebar, and we'll see you next Monday, 10 a.m. Central. Take care, everybody. Bye.